In just about a month, Rise of Skywalker, the final film in the Skywalker Saga, hits theaters. In preparation, I've been reviewing each of the movies in the Skywalker Saga in release order. We're in part 4, that means we're talking about the Phantom Menace. So let's talk about it.
McCallum.
I just felt I needed to add that today. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comment section. Share your take on Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. This is an interesting one. This is very much a generational divide because you have the people that grew up watching the original trilogy and were so excited when this movie came out, and then you have a whole generation of people that grew up on the prequels. As I go into this, I'm going to kick things off with a little bit of a retrospective backstory on where the movie came from. Then I'm going to kind of give my traditional review on it, all my thoughts, spoiler filled, and then at the end, real quick, briefly, I'm going to talk about how I would have fixed Phantom Menace. I think there's a lot of good ideas inside of the movie. I think it's a film that could have been fixed. I'll have that at the end of this. One final thing before we get started, this video is brought to you by Audible. One of my main sources for the backstory in each of these reviews is a book called How Star Wars Conquered the Universe. You can get the audiobook for free if you sign up for a free trial of Audible at audibletrial.com/Sean Chandler. I do own a physical copy of the book, and I've listened to the audiobook from Audible 2 separate times. I highly recommend it if you're a Star Wars fan. It's kind of a must read, or if you're like me and like to read with your ears, it's a must listen. You can get that book for free if you sign up for a free trial of Audible at audibletrial.com/Sean Chandler. It really does give the history of Star Wars and a biography of Lucas in a way that is very enriching, and I love that kind of stuff. Highly recommended. With that said, let's get started talking about the backstory. While George Lucas was writing Empire Strikes Back and starting to realize the big revelations about Anakin and Darth Vader, he started to write that backstory for Anakin Skywalker, his rise, his fall, the rise of the Emperor, and he started to realize that A New Hope, or Star Wars, was actually the 4th story, and there's a prequel trilogy that comes before all of this that tells the story of Anakin.
In order to write that first script, I had to write a backstory about where Darth Vader came from, how the kids evolved, his wife, how Ben related to all that, how the Emperor came to power, and that ended up being the basis for the projects that I'm working on now.
It's designed to fit in one big package, so it definitely is not going to be completely different. It does take place earlier than the ones that you've seen.
But after Return of the Jedi, he'd spent about 10 years making the Star Wars trilogy. He was a bit exhausted from the process. He wanted to raise a family, and he didn't quite think that technology was there to fully capture his vision for what he wanted to do for the prequels, so he kind of sat on the idea for a while.
My oldest daughter was born during Jedi. Since then, I slowed down quite a bit, and I focused more on my family. This is going to be the first time I go back and try to do a movie of this scale with this much intensity.
Jump forward to the early 90s and technology started to catch up with Lucas's vision. Movies like Jurassic Park and T2 marked this massive leap forward in what was possible. So November 1st, 1994, George Lucas sat down to start writing Episode 1, or what was at the time called The Beginning.
This is the 1st of November, 1994. Today is my first day of writing the new Star Wars series. Took my kids to school this morning. My oldest daughter was sick all night. I got no sleep whatsoever.
The book, How Star Wars Conquered the Universe, kind of outlines some of the different versions of the script. Some of them did have an older Anakin, but essentially the idea that was later filmed was present in all of the versions of the script. When the film came out, it was a massive cultural event. Despite the fact it did get mixed reviews right out of the gate and audiences were a little bit split on it, there was a whole bunch of 17-year-olds like this guy right here that went to go see it on loop and on repeat as many times as we could. And it was a pretty massive hit at the times. A bunch of us were trying to get it to actually beat Titanic at the box office, which it did not do and did not get close to doing. But it was a film that was really important for a lot of us. Of course, I have mixed feelings on it, looking back on it, a lot of frustrations at some of the choices that he made. At the same time, there was just something really special about Star Wars being back on the big screen. Return of the Jedi came out when I was about 1.5 years old, so this movie was the first one I got to be a part of that wave of excitement as a new Star Wars movie was coming out. Like, I remember when the trailer first dropped and we're like, what movies is it playing in front of? And we would go to see that movie just to see the trailer and leave. back then that was a thing that was worth doing because you could download the trailer, but it would take about 4 hours with your dial-up modem, and it would be this very low-res, small quality thing. So if you wanted to see it in high quality, you had to go to the theater and do that. So it's a really special time that I have a lot of nostalgia for, while at the same time being able to recognize many of the faults with the film. With that said, let's get started talking about the good. And the first thing that comes to mind here is that I think that this is the best structured of the prequel films. It has very clear act breaks. You know what is going on in each section of the film and what we're moving towards. You know when you kind of shift directions into the next act. The whole film has very clear objectives inside of it. So act number 1, we're trying to be diplomats, and then we realize we're in this very dangerous situation where they have to try and escape with the Queen. Act 2, they are on the run with the Queen in trying to get support, and so it's them on the run to Tatooine and then to Coruscant. And then Act 3, they return to try and stop the Trade Federation and rescue Naboo. Very clear objectives and what they're trying to accomplish in each one of the acts, and for me, that's really important, especially when you get into like Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, where I think it's a movie that's just totally devoid of structure whatsoever. Just stuff happens in order, but there's not a lot of like forward momentum because of the nature of the structure of all of it. I appreciate the fact that this one feels thought out. It's not just connecting the dots between the beginning of this trilogy and the big fall. No, it itself tells a story about Naboo and trying to save Naboo from the Trade Federation. This is also why I think that this is a movie that can be fixed. A lot of people hate this movie. They think it's the worst of the Star Wars movies. And when they start going into why they hate it, they're normally talking about the execution, the specific elements inside of it, the pacing, Jar Jar, things like that. Things we will talk about in the bad section of this, but they're rarely talking about the overarching story and flow of the narrative. And that's why I think it's a very salvageable film, which I'll explain why later inside of this. Another great thing about this movie is the casting itself. You get a young Ewan McGregor coming off Train Spotting. When the movie came out, he was just this guy that had done an indie film that had gotten a lot of buzz. Now we know him as kind of this A-lister that's been showing up and stuff for 25 years. At the time, he really just kind of had this one big credit to his name, and him being cast as Obi-Wan was a little bit like, who is this guy? Who are they getting this? A guy that was in the drug movie that came out a few years ago? And so that's great casting. Even as you think about, they've been talking about making maybe an Obi-Wan movie. Now it's turned into an Obi-Wan series for Disney Plus. And that's one of the things that people have legitimately wanted, that there's a lot of like positive buzz for it, because he is great in this role. People like Hayden Christensen weren't as well received and kind of maybe were hurt more by the direction from George Lucas and the dialogue that he was given. But Ewan McGregor was so good in this role that he was able to overcome all of that. He feels like a younger Alec Guinness while feeling like his own performance. He does the lightsaber stuff with excellence. He was all in. And so that's great casting. Then you have like Liam Neeson, an actor that of course has been in all sorts of dramatic roles, kind of schlocky action stuff over the last decade, but a guy that brings a presence to the screen that you can buy him as this Jedi Master that's got a little bit of a rogue bent inside of him going against the council at times. You get Natalie Portman as Padme inside of it, another person that at the time the movie came out, she had acting credits. She'd been in The Professional and had kind of gotten some buzz because of that, but she wasn't like this super big megastar. The start of Natalie Portman as big super famous person was being cast in this movie. Credibility from The Professional, Luc Besson's film. If you haven't seen The Professional, or Leon as it's called outside of the US, you should go check it out. But this is where she became the star. And once again, Hayden Christensen, her partner in all of this, kind of got eaten up, chewed up by the George Lucas machine and hasn't been well received and didn't launch it into an A-list career. Natalie Portman, because she's a great actress and was cast really nicely for this role, does a great job and became a star using this as her launching pad for all of that. Another great thing about this film and the prequels in general is that it really does make the Star Wars universe feel so much bigger. To George Lucas's point that he felt like technology really limited him when he was making the original films, especially the first one, and then technology caught up with him. And I will get into all the faults of his excessive use in CGI in Attack of the Clones and then Revenge of the Sith. But one of the positives of that is it just makes the worlds look so big when you can go to these planets and just have these photorealistic images of this massive Naboo and massive armies. And then you go to Coruscant and it's this planet that's one big gigantic city, and you start to feel the scope and the size of this universe in a way they just really couldn't do in any way with the original trilogy. You think of the locations that they went to in the original trilogy, and they'll kind of feel small, like Cloud City, gorgeous, but it's this one city up in the clouds. And then, you go to Endor and we're just in the woods. Hoth, secret base. Mos Eisley, we go to this one bar, and then when you go to Coruscant, you just see massive size and scale to it. Likewise, we get to see what the Republic looked like and little tastes of a more peaceful time where there was more order to the galaxy. And I appreciate that it makes the world bigger as you see a visualized version of what Obi-Wan Kenobi told Luke Skywalker about. Another great thing, of course, about this film, John Williams' score. And I've said it many times before, I think he is the greatest film composer of all time. And pretty much all of his Star Wars scores are basically perfect. And as much as people my age typically crap on the prequels, there's just no way that you can even argue against the music that he created for these films. The music is just on par with everything before. The big standout here, of course, is Duel of the Fates. Many people consider it the greatest piece of Star Wars music. I wouldn't say that, but I'm not going to argue with you either because I know why you're saying it. He did a fantastic job making fantastic music once again for Star Wars that's new and different. Duel of the Fates does not sound like anything that was in the original trilogy, but it fits inside the Star Wars universe. It doesn't feel like, what is this new music that they brought into it? And that's when you have a great composer that can keep adding new layers on top of what they did before without copying themselves and just expanding that. And we'll continue talking about it throughout all the prequels that he kept creating fantastic music for these films. Another thing I really enjoy about these films is the lightsaber duels. Some people have been critical of them as time has passed as just being too choreographed, too dance-like, where there's moments where you can see pretty easily that, Ewan McGregor is swinging somewhere where a lightsaber isn't yet because that's the choreography and he's just ahead of things. And there's a truth to that. But if you watch some of the documentary stuff where they talked about why they went with this style, to me, it all made sense. George Lucas's argument was, in the original trilogy, we saw a guy in a robot suit whose limbs have been chopped off, and we're seeing a guy that has very limited force training. When we go and we watch these movies, we're seeing Jedis in their prime that kind of have this intuitive, the force is working through them so they can see things in advance, and so they can do fantastical things and flippy kick stuff while moving in a manner that feels like they're ahead of everything. There's a logic inside of it, so I've always been fine with that. I've never had a problem with the fact that how choreographed it looks because of the universe you're in, and that's, to me, good choreography. When you understand the characters themselves and when you say they're doing mind tricks, they can kind of see the future, they can work things out in their mind, suddenly you can do a choreography that's different from what you would do in any other context. If you do if you do a sword battle with this sort of stuff, it looks kind of like, what is going on? People can't do that. They're way too fast on these movements. But in Star Wars, with Jedis and Sith in their prime, it absolutely makes sense. And so I think that this might be the best stuff, whether you're talking about them battling the droids and just being so confident in the moves that they're doing, either one of the duels with Darth Maul, and then, of course, the one at the end with Ray Park, this kind of fantastic martial artist that can do cool flippy kick things with the dual lightsaber that became one of these iconic elements inside of Star Wars. I think it's just very cool little sequence. And speaking of the action, the pod racing sequence itself is a pretty dynamic, exciting sequence. Perhaps a little bit too long, but in general, it's done in a way that you're in on the vehicles as they're going through these craters, doing stuff that you really couldn't do before this movie came out. You couldn't have a chase this fast through this many types of environments and have it be this photorealistic. And so it's a sequence I think has aged pretty well. The sequence in and of itself, the context, would they have done this? Should they have done this? The story element, okay, we can question all of that. but I think it's a pretty good little race inside of the movie. In general with this film, I find it more frustrating than just awful or something like that. There's a bunch of things, as I've just discussed, that I think really work. I think the overall big picture of it is a film that should be better than the movie that we got. Going back to what many people have said on many occasions about George Lucas, that he's a great idea person. He's not necessarily a great writer or director. And this movie, I think, shows that. He spent probably the most time thinking about it and writing it. And so the big picture stuff, I think, is pretty good, and the pieces are all in place. But then when you sit down in the specific choices that he made for how to make things happen, that's where it loses it a little bit. Likewise, in some of the direction and all of that is where it breaks down a little bit. So I can see this one and appreciate the big picture while being frustrated by all the negative things that a lot of people don't like about this film. With that said, let's move on to the bad. Unfortunately, when it comes to this movie, the issues, the problems are so obvious and in your face that they normally disguise and hide the positive aspects of the film. Some of the most obvious ones, of course, Jar Jar Binks and the Guns in general are just a really bad idea. If you even kind of back up, not just kind of Jar Jar stepping in poo and his sense of humor and the slapstick, the Gungans in general inside of the film are an odd side quest, is what it feels like. George wanted to have a big final battle in the movie that was on land. It was a lightsaber duel. It was in the castle and it was in space. So it's just massive on all fronts. And so to have a big, massive ground battle, he needed to come up with an army. So he comes up with this idea of the Gungans. So we have this little side quest in the first act of the movie where they get to the planet. They probably should just go right into the castle, get Queen Amidala and get out of there. But we need to set up the Gungans for later in the movie. So then you have this like 10, 15 minute sequence where they're with Jar Jar and Jar Jar takes them under the water. And then they go to this Gungan kingdom and then they go on this water trip across the planet through the planet's core. And it just feels like there's so much kind of stuff inside of this happening that doesn't need to be there. It's just like a sequence there just to have action and set up something for later on inside of the film that you can just trim this stuff down and the movies just about instantly so much better. I'm sure there's some fan cuts where they did just cut the Gungans out of the movie because they're so unimportant actually to what happens inside of the plot. And then more specifically, they're written with this very weird broken English, maybe Jamaican influence inside of it, or the Jamaican stereotype of broken English with some of what they're doing. And their dialogue, it feels unforgivable. I mean, Misa wants a Yusa in big doo-doo, saying stuff like that. You even have like the king of their people like going at certain points in time. And it's just so childish. It just really doesn't feel right inside of Star Wars. Now, Star Wars has had slapstick jokes. They've had cute sidekicks. This feels like it just went so far down that path in the entire concept of the Gungans that it's hard to not imagine that someone should have been there saying, George, you can't go this far. Like, you did cute teddy bears. This is something else. You're trying to do cute creatures that talk funny and step on things and make funny faces. No, George, no, you can't do fart jokes with these things. And nobody told him no. And so then he executes the Gungans in this way that's just so cringeworthy from beginning to end if you're over the age of 10. Of course, Jar Jar being the sidekick with them throughout the entire movie, it taints a lot of the film because he's trying to entertain by having Jar Jar accidentally put his face inside of a laser, inside of a pod's beams at the end of it and doing the slapstick routine where he's tripping around and things like that just doesn't belong in Star Wars. It's just like, that's the stuff that you just feel the fact that like someone else needed to be in the mix, telling him no, writing and directing. That all this stuff goes away, and the most obvious faults with the film of these ridiculous Gungans that talk ridiculous is gone as soon as someone else is in the mix that can tell him no and make decisions instead of him. Adding to the mix, there's a lot of discussion about the racial stereotypical voices of both the Federation people, New Gunray, then the Gungans, and then the Watto, and the Watto feeling like this Jewish stereotype, and then our Trade Federation feeling like Asian stereotypes in the way that's very specific way that English is broken. Once again, like there's only so many ways that people can talk in these things. You can't invent new languages for everything, and you don't want everything to be in having to read subtitles for everything. But when everyone seems to speak broken English in the style of a specific group of people, that's weird. That's weird. And I don't know what George thought he was doing. I don't know why he headed down that path. I don't read any deeper meanings into George Lucas because of it, but it's just a really weird, bad idea that someone should have told him, George, don't do this. You can't give everyone a stereotypical kind of racist, broken style of broken English. But that's what we got in the movie that was delivered. The movie also has some serious pacing issues. It starts off at a very brisk pace that they get on this ship where they're doing these negotiations, and then they have to battle droids, and then they're escaping to the planet where they're being chased, and then they get with Jar Jar, who takes them to the Gungan Palace that leads to this underwater kind of travel adventure sequence, and then we battle at the palace again, and then we're in a spaceship trying to escape a blockade. And then it just slows to a halt for about 25 minutes as soon as we get to Tatooine. I mean, it's just nonstop action beats for about 25 minutes or so, and then 25 more minutes with no action whatsoever until we get to the pod race. And then pod race happens and it picks up, and we have this 5-minute long, fast-moving sequence. We get out of that. Shortly after that, Darth Maul shows up. We get a lightsaber battle. We go to Coruscant, and it just slows down for about 20 more minutes while we talk about do they have confidence in Chancellor Valorum? And so like 2 separate times in this movie, it just goes from fast to slow for extended periods of time. And that's when people talk about pacing issues, this is one where you can see it pretty clearly, where it's just quick, talk, quick. And now we're talking about politics, intergalactic politics for a while. And then we go back to the planet, and it's, once again, a big, gigantic battle. And that's not good. That's very poor in both. You have an idea for a movie that has good structure, but the execution of it, the way that it's cut together, the way the stories kind of interlap together, leads to big, gigantic lulls inside of it, and then sequences that are almost too much action. As I mentioned, the first 25, 30 minutes of the film, the Gungan underwater sequence, it's action, it keeps things moving quickly, but it doesn't really need to be there. You don't need that much action in your first 30 minutes. To the extent that sometimes I watch the movie and I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot there's this whole thing where they travel through the planet core with big gigantic shark things trying to eat them, and they're cracking jokes like there's always a bigger fish. That's not a good sign when you totally forget about things like that. Speaking of the execution inside of the film, the movie has a lot of accidental heroes in the third act of it. As you get to this part where they have these big sequences going on, we have this Gungan battle, and you got Anakin up in space. And the way that the Gungans are somewhat successful is we're following Jar Jar, and as we're watching it, my kids start saying out loud, Jar Jar, he's so funny, he's accidentally saving the day. He keeps tripping and taking out bad guys. That's funny. Funny, yes. Not exactly great storytelling. Like, it's not a great way to get me invested in your big battle if you're just playing it for jokes. We're not being victorious because our heroes are brave and valiant and talented and skilled and growing and changing. It's because Jar Jar tripped. And then on the space front, you have Anakin accidentally getting in a ship. He just wants to shoot some bad guys and ends up pushing a button that takes him up to battle up in space and kind of crashes somewhere in the right place by accident, starts taking things out. Contrast that with Luke Skywalker in A New Hope. Father-son contrast in their first adventures battling bad guys in spaceships. Luke is this person that they kind of establish him as a good pilot who's a good shot. And then as they're going into this battle, he talks about, hey, back on my planet, we're able to shoot these types, showing the fact that he's good at pinpoint accuracy. And then he's been learning the Force throughout the film, just a little bit. And so then he's in the trench, everyone else has tried and failed to shoot this one little faulty exhaust pipe. and then he trusts the Force. It's a completion of his character. We've learned that he's talented. We've seen him be brave. Even the fact that he got in this cockpit to go to war means he's a brave person. And now the completion of his arc is he's now trusting the Force, bringing all these pieces together, and he saves the day because of a story arc. Or Anakin accidentally gets in a ship, goes up into space, and accidentally just happens to shoot the right thing, that just happens to blow up the thing, that just happens to take out the droid army. One of these is exciting and like, yeah, he was victorious. The other one's like, you just don't care. Like, it's pretty easy to forget that Anakin was really important inside of this battle on Naboo because it wasn't because of anything that was interesting. It was just, oops, he just happened to be in the right place. Those are the sorts of things that knock this movie down, that make it so it doesn't have the big, powerful payoff moments. It's just lazy, goofy execution of plot points that could be good mirroring of what happened inside of the other films. And of course, you have to talk about midichlorians, and they're just a bad idea. They're a bad idea that in this weird way, it's like George, who seems to spend so much time thinking about his mythology and studying ancient mythology and storytelling and trying to work in all of these pieces. He had such a distinct view of the Force and how mystical and metaphysical it was. And then he makes this movie and introduces this idea that undoes all of that. Like all the things that made the Force interesting and the way Yoda talked about it is now turned into science class inside of this film. And you just go, what, George, why did you do that? I don't get it. Why did you think that this was a good compliment to what Yoda said about the Force instead of something that just erases what came before with something that's far less interesting? It kind of feels like a betrayal of everything that you have taught us about the Force up to this point in time. That's just not a good thing to do. And even like they start talking about midichlorian counts as if they're like skill points in a video game. You're like, what? Why would you take it in this direction? And then there's even just kind of smaller details inside of it where like some of the kids that Anakin is friends with, they're just George Lucas's buddies' kids. So some of them are running around with braces and things like that. And you're like, what? Huh? What? You got a kid with braces? I mean, I guess I'm not saying that you can't have braces in the world of Star Wars. It just feels weird to have one kid that randomly has braces in the entire Star Wars universe. And then there's other stupid ideas inside of this too of it doesn't add anything to have Anakin create C-3PO. It raises a lot of questions. It creates like this thing like what benefit does this add? How does this make anything better? It just feels like a random Easter egg to throw into the mix that he doesn't need to be there. You just put him in there to be like, Anakin created him. Get it? Get what? Like, what do you mean? Get what? You just put it in there. It's just a random thing that you decided to include. It does not affect the story. It doesn't make anything more interesting. And it only creates so many issues for the film in general. And that's what makes this film so frustrating, is that these choices that were made are just feel baffling that they weren't stopped. It's not a bold, interesting choice to make Anakin create C-3PO. It's just a bad idea. It's not a bold, like, maybe it's bold to be like, let's reinterpret the Force as these midichlorian things that can be scientifically measured and calculated. But it's also an idea that any normal person hears that and goes, ooh, I don't like that. That doesn't feel right. The voices of Watto and the Gungans, like they clearly are not a good idea to do it the way that he did it. The Gungans and their humor does not fit in Star Wars, so it's so frustrating that so many things are just right there in front of the camera, right in your face, being like, ooh, this is just not a good idea. This is not good execution. This is not what Star Wars is. In which case leaves a lot of us feeling frustrated by this movie as we watch it and want to love Star Wars, want to support Star Wars, want to be excited for George Lucas. And there's just so many bad ideas in this movie that I think could have been great. Speaking of how this movie could be great, let's move on to the section where I talk about how I think you could have fixed this film. Many people have said it before that George Lucas is a great idea person. He has an amazing imagination that can build these fantastic worlds and think through themes and different types of stories and environments that are interesting and unique and complement one another. But when it comes to taking those ideas and writing a script and then directing actors, he has a lot more faults. He's also someone who's such an idea person that he's not always the best at filtering through which one of his ideas are good and which ones are bad. He needs people to kind of keep him in his place a little bit, as we all do. That people that can take all of these fantastic ideas and then decide the best direction. And that conflict with other creatives is where the best ideas really come from. So at the core of how you fix episode 1, I think right off the bat, he needed a co-writer. He writes the first 1 or 2 drafts, like here's the basic idea of what I want for this movie, and then he passes it along to someone else. So some people at that time that could have been some good options. David Cope, who did Jurassic Park right before this, one of the movies that kind of inspired him to be like, hey, technology's there. Get the guy that took the book from Michael Crichton and turned it into this fantastic blockbuster, hand him George Lucas' story and have him kind of run with it. That's one option. Or Frank Darabont, who did Shawshank Redemption in '94, Green Mile. He had worked on the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. He had a history with George Lucas, and I believe he did one of the versions of what turned into Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skulls in the 90s. He did one of the early versions of it. So he's an obvious choice to potentially be the person to take George's script and work with it. Or you could have just go with the obvious one also of Lawrence Kasdan. Get the guy that did Empire, the guy that did Return of the Jedi, and once again, have him run with George's ideas and then give it that polish that made, Empire such a fantastic film. So those are the 3 people that would kind of come to my mind to work on it. Which one would be best? You don't really know because you don't know what script they would turn in. I think all of them would be solid options. Then also you need a different director to kind of come in, I think, who enjoys working with actors more and enjoys the process of it all, and allow George to be the idea guy, the person not bogged down by the day-to-day. I think one of the obvious choices to come in for Star Wars would be Joe Johnston. He worked on the original trilogy and then went off and did movies like Rocketeer that kind of continued some of the spirit of what George was doing with the Indiana Jones movies, and he did Jumanji. And so I think you bring him in as this director, but maybe a little bit more of a Richard Marquand type relationship with George, where George is very present with his ideas, but the person that's there making it happen is Joe Johnston. I think that feels like a really good partnership, that you get the strength of George's ideas and then a director that loves that side of doing things. When it comes to how I would fix the story, as I mentioned before, I think the structure, the general idea of it actually works pretty well. If you have a 1-page synopsis of the story, you go, oh, that's a pretty interesting little Star Wars movie that has adventure. It has kind of the hero's journey with Anakin inside of it. But when you see the movie executed, we're just spending way too much time talking about political disputes, all kind of in chunks. And that's where the movie doesn't work. So, and it's also unclear. The Plinkett reviews have kind of pointed out the movie doesn't really have a clear lead character. Is it Qui-Gon? Is it Obi-Wan? If it's Obi-Wan, why does he disappear in the middle of it? What's Qui-Gon's character arc if it's him? So it's a movie that has some issues with stuff like that. So what I would propose with the film is that instead of having both Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon going to Tatooine, and once you get to Tatooine, then Obi-Wan just stays with the ship and he disappears for 45 minutes inside of the film. And then once we leave Tatooine, we go to Coruscant for 20 minutes and it just slows to a halt. What if these stories kind of run a little bit more parallel to each other and you make Obi-Wan very clearly kind of our lead person inside of it? And you send Qui-Gon off as the master that has his own kind of side adventure. He goes to Coruscant when they go to Tatooine. So you kind of split up. I'll go over here to try and get the support of the Senate, and then you go over here to hide her for a little bit before we decide what we're going to do. So I think you instead of having all of the political stuff in one 20-minute chunk, you spread it out in smaller chunks over kind of the span of the movie. And I don't know that we need a section of it where Anakin goes in front of young Yoda and and not young Yoda, less old Yoda, and says he's not ready, only to have them say that he is ready. We don't need that. You can just kind of cut that out of the movie, and you just have the stuff at the end where they like reluctantly tell Obi-Wan yes that he can train him. And likewise, this gives a whole movie where Obi-Wan and Anakin are building their bond together, as opposed to they only meet like going into the third act of the film, because Qui-Gon was with him all on Tatooine. No, you have Obi-Wan with him building that rapport and that relationship. Another change I would make right here is I don't think it adds anything to have him be a kid. It creates a lot of problems for the trilogy as a whole if Anakin isn't a grown-up. So you can't build the dating relationship between nearly 18-year-old girl with a kid. You just can't do that for obvious reasons, and it makes it creepy a little bit when you move into Attack of the Clones. You're like, oh, you're all grown up. We should get married. There's some problems with it. That's awkward. So you just make him the same age as her. You make them both comparable ages to Luke and Leia as they were in A New Hope. And so they're both kind of these late teens. And that means that, once again, the rapport between him and Obi-Wan is strong because they spend the film together. They're also closer in age. And so then you feel the kind of bromance between the two of them, that he's a good friend, and you see it in this film. And you start the romance inside of this film, as opposed to having to wait 10 years, or not 10 years in terms of the timeline of the movies, to when he's older in the next one. Along these same lines, other change I would make is Qui-Gon, or you take the plot line in Attack of the Clones about Obi-Wan going and kind of researching Camino and the clones, and I'll kind of take all of that and put it in this movie. And you start the Clone War a whole movie earlier by putting it here as opposed to there. Qui-Gon is on that journey inside of this film, not just doing politics, but trying to figure out how to save the day. And through that, he kind of discovers maybe this thing over here, this army. So when you move into the third act of the film, instead of the Gungans, you kind of remove them as this large group, have some version of Jar Jar that's less obnoxious, less slapstick, but having a little bit of a funnier character. I think that's totally fine. Not over the top like Jar Jar, dialed back a little bit, move the other Gungans out of it. And at the end of the movie, the save the day moment is the clones showing up. The clones showing up to battle the droid army. So you have the finale of Attack of the Clones happening in this one, setting up Attack of the Clones not as another setup movie for the Clone Wars, but a movie of the Clone Wars. That's a better movie than the movie that we got. And also with this, when you have Anakin as the hero at the end of the film, it's mirroring Luke. They're the same age, and he's learning to use the Force. And also what you can do if he's older, you don't have the cute kid factor of, like, you don't want to see a cute kid having a dark side to him. You put the downfall of Anakin in Episode 1. His pride, his arrogance. And likewise, you have him looking at the Republic and being like, there's some problems with it. There's some problems with the Jedi, that puts the seeds that has him turning to the dark side later on. And you make these changes. It's structurally, the movie's not terribly different. At least the Obi-Wan arc, it plays out basically the same. There is this side quest with Qui-Gon that's different. And I think you get a movie that instantly is a lot better because you remove most of the slapstick humor. The payoff at the end of it is the start of the Clone Wars, which hits a lot harder. The payoff at the end of the movie is Anakin being the hero that stopped this. He was brave. He went in. It's not by accident, but he actually kind of saved the day in this situation. I think you do that, and this movie actually becomes a very good Star Wars movie that sets up a better trilogy than what we got, because Anakin's story, I think, is spread out properly, because romance starts earlier, Clone Wars starts earlier, so we get to see him as a hero in the next movie, and we're not starting the relationship in the next movie. It's already kind of been going on. I think that all works better. Remember to share your take down below in the comment section. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Is this your least favorite? Do you think it's actually a lot better than it gets credit for? Let me know down below in the comment section. Also, remember, I'm reviewing all these movies. The playlist is right up here. And so this is part 4. So you can see the original trilogy reviews right up there. And remember, you can get that free audiobook at audibletrial.com/Sean Chandler. If you want to hear the backstory of Star Wars, I highly recommend checking out How Star Wars Conquered the Universe. As a Star Wars fan, I can get a lot of enjoyment out of this film. I do find it to be watchable, but it's a very frustrating watch because of those very specific choices that George made that you just wish someone could have stopped him, talked some sense into him to back off on some of these bad ideas, skip some of them entirely, and focus in on his strengths. That's not the movie we got, but the movie we do have, I think, gets a little bit too much hate. though I understand where the hate's coming from. It's a C overall, but a 6.5 out of 10 on the entertainment scale. This is one of those movies where I'm pretty split on it. I can acknowledge its faults while getting a lot of enjoyment out of it at the same time. Tell me what you thought down below in the comments section. If you want more content like this, check out that playlist right over there with a bunch of my other Star Wars content. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.